I don't think that we should do this. I basically disagree with every point that was presented here. I think that this could present something really interesting. I think this idea actually has some legs. I'm going to show the idea here and read it out. So, again, this was pulled from the official Phobies Discord. There's a feedback forum there. You can submit basically any idea you want to be discussed. There's a lot of things going on. So this idea is, well, right there. It's right there. You get it. So read along with me. Phobies is already marketed as partly a CCG, even though the gameplay features no card game elements. Have players make decks of a set number of Phobies that they can bring into battle. During a match, players can only summon Phobies from their deck instead of the entire pool, or their entire pool, of owned Phobies. This accomplishes two things. It actually gives Phobies a reason to call itself a CCG, and it gives players a more unique identity. As it stands, we all feel kind of the same. Sure, people own different Phobies at different levels, but ostensibly, if a player sticks with the game, there's going to be a lot of overlap between you and your opponent's Phobies. And you're both kind of bringing the same thing to the table each match. If you let us create unique decks with limits, you can craft something more personal with our favorite Phobies, or even just a deck for a specific strategy. This also adds more strategic depth to the game. Instead of being able to respond to any situation with any Phobie, we are limited to a smaller pool. So, I did respond to this thread. There are a few people defending it, aside from the original poster. I'm going to shrink this a little bit, but I'll try and keep it up here. There are a few people defending it. I am not one of them. I am opposed to this idea. I'm not going to say vehemently opposed because let's start out with trying to defend it. Quick aside, everybody, before we get into the actual content, I was accepted into the Phobies Content Affiliate Program, the content creator program, you might call it. Shout out to the Phobies team and thank you for that. But the reason I'm telling you, everybody out there, dear viewer, dear listener, is to let everybody know that I do receive some compensation from the Phobies team as a result of being part of that program. Now, I loved Phobies before, and I still love Phobies now, and I expect I will still continue to love Phobies in the future. So look forward to more Phobies content coming from Random's Thoughts. So now, on with the show. Now, again, I'm calling this idea insane because it is just such a wild departure. And while I've had a similar thought, Phobies is not really a CCG. At no point did I say I think the game should move to this direction. So again, I'm not saying it's insane or crazy or wild or anything like that to crap on it. I have reasons why I think it is bad, but we're going to get into that. Chat saying that it doesn't sound bad on paper, but in practice it doesn't work. We'll talk about that momentarily. It's an interesting concept, at least for sure. Where players, the first problem is I don't see where the real realm of the subconscious. So fears manifest. If we pull up the use devious tactics and unleash a dazzling array of abilities and attacks to achieve victory, I actually transpose that. I don't think that we should do this. I basically disagree with every point that was presented here, and we'll break it down. Now, in the original poster or OP's defense, Phobies does, in its very description on Steam, I'm looking at it right now, tactical card collecting strategy game. It does not label itself as a CCG, technically. At least as far as I'm aware. I don't think I've seen anywhere where it explicitly calls itself a CCG. Now, what is a CCG? It's a collectible card game. So I absolutely get why people were conflating the two. But as far as I know, they do not have that acronym anywhere actually tagged on Phobies. I could be wrong. Let me know down in the comments or in chat if somebody has something. Phobies does meet this criteria. You collect cards. The cards are the game pieces, where they summon, they create, they manifest the Phobies themselves. I've always felt, and we've talked about it before, that this feels like there's a disconnect. There's plainly a disconnect because there's a ton of people on my stream showing up in YouTube comments, clearly the OP here, bringing it up, that it's not a card game. No one thinks of when they think card game, especially collectible card game, They think Magic the Gathering. They think Hearthstone. They think Duelist. They think Mythgard. They think this. They think that. They do not think Phobies. Most people are going to realize very quickly that Phobies is not a card game. It's chess, or it's a tactics game, a skirmish game, a miniatures game, that sort of thing. And I agree with Chad, who's saying if I wanted to play a card game, there are plenty out there I could play. I'd rather play Phobies. And that's the thing. I don't think, overall, I don't think it is wise to expend resources to try and convert Phobies into something that it clearly was not intended to be. The devs chose to create this game. Now, you could disagree with the marketing, the description, that sort of thing, and maybe the description on Steam changes, the description on the Apple Store or Google Play or whatever. That's one thing. We're asking to completely overhaul the game. Now, I brought up several points that in my response to this in Discord, but we're going to go one by one for each of these things and why I think that there are problems with this. So giving it a reason to call itself a CCG, to me, is meaningless. Again, they don't technically call themselves a CCG. Phobies just describes itself as a collectible card game. Now, again, or card collecting game. Again, collectible card game is what CCG stands for, but you are literally collecting cards. It doesn't get any more strict definition than that. My issue with it is that it seems to emphasize, the description seems to emphasize the fact that you are collecting cards. That is a major component of your collection. That's not what I care about for this game. So you want to change how it's described? Sure. I'm okay with that. Perfectly fine. It gives players a more unique identity. This is where we're talking basically the second half of the first point. I disagree with this. You can do that today in Phobies, right now. You could today be the dozer guy. You could today be the bad sushi guy. You could today be the whatever. Insert thing that isn't quote unquote meta. You're absolutely making your life more difficult in a lot of scenarios. Is that going to change if you create this deck setup? Maybe. Most likely not, and most likely it's going to exacerbate the exact problems that people are trying to solve, and we'll get to that. So I disagree with this, and we'll explain more as we go on. As it stands, we all kind of feel the same. Yes, that is also going to be true in the deck format, if you were to bring certain things. You know why? Because we've observed that for over 30 years now across Magic the Gathering, the WoW TCG, Verse 1.0, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, 7 different Mortal Kombat card games, Rifts, Gridiron Fantasy Football, I'm listing games that I played, Lightseekers, Cardfight Vanguard, I'd have to turn around and go, I have literally tens of thousands of cards, hundreds of thousands of cards. If the goal of a game is to win, strategies are going to tend to homogenize over time. And obviously, the game itself and the game pieces and everything can change this. But if you're talking from a competitive aspect, things are going to converge simply because the goal is to win, and therefore those particular strategies, those game pieces, those whatever, they are the best way to win. This is not necessarily going to change it, other than maybe artificially inflating it, but then you possibly introduce a rock, paper, scissors scenario because, again, the game was not designed with this in mind. The game was originally designed to be what we play now. So it could require, aside from just introducing how this mode works, and it already exists in the game, but we'll get to that later. Aside from just introducing the mode, now you possibly have to rebalance everything. Literally everything. And that's kind of scary. Because that, aside from the enormity of the work and alienating all the people that came to and still are with and love Phobies today for what it is, as Chad was saying earlier, if you want to play a card game, and I hate this argument personally, but there are plenty of options for you to do it. Now, I don't like that argument because if I like Phobies because I think it's a really cool, unique concept from the lore, the game outside of the game, all the different art and Vorthos elements. I fell in love with it. I would love to have a card game. Me personally, I would love to have a card game in the Phobies universe. Does Phobies need to stop existing to make that card game? Absolutely not. I don't think that should be the case. I'm not trying to put words in the, get the right place on the camera, put words in this person's mouth, but if that's the implication, no, absolutely not. Don't do that. And again, maybe that's not what they're saying. Now, I disagree that all things feel the same as well for each game, because at the end of the day, this sort of game also, like real-time strategies, where you have technically your entire faction's assets available to you from the word go. Well, we have to climb the tech tree, but you can get there if you build your strategy around it. Some are better, some are worse. It's changed by the maps, it's changed by the matchup, that sort of thing. At the end of the day, you could do these things if you just outplay your opponent. And it's the same thing for Phobies. If you want to make something happen, figure out how to make it happen. If it's not working, well, you have to accept whether you want to win or you want to do for funsies stuff. And that's always true in anything competitive, whether we're talking about a true CCG or not. Trust me, I've been playing competitive games for almost 30 years. Competitive card games. Dozens of them. This is how it works. I'm not making it up. So let's continue. If a player sticks with the game, there's going to be a lot of overlap between you and your opponent's Phobies, and both are kind of bringing the same thing to the table each match. That is going to be the identical thing in the new world as well. Now, again, you could have some artificial, we'll say, diversity variance in game pieces introduced, but then it becomes, okay, well, I want to play an aggressive strategy. Then I do these things. I want to play a slow controlling strategy, so like turrets. I do this thing. I want to bank for the big dude and stall the board out. I do this thing. And now your gameplay patterns, you personally are more limited because you can't adapt necessarily in those particular moments. You are doing what you set out to do before the game started, which to me, as somebody who loves card games and has played them for decades, plural, that is one of the more frustrating things, is when you sit down to a match and you realize as soon as you sit down, they play one thing on turn one and you go, I literally can't win. Unless they make an egregious error or there's insane variance, which there isn't in Phobies, you just lose from the word go. That's kind of how it works. I'll hydrate action. So we're kind of coming back to the same issue no matter what. And again, we would run the risk of alienating people anyway. So we'll continue. If you let us create decks with limits, we can craft something more personal to our favorite Phobies. You can already do this. You can literally use your favorite Phobies, because I am going to go out on a limb and say that if your favorite phobie is bad sushi, it's probably still going to be bad in the new world, because the things that most people are going to bring, say even jar cannon, is likely to show up in all of these scenarios anyway. Now, building a deck to a specific strategy, which is the next point that brings up, actually is where, again, things go off the rails. Because if you introduce this hyper-linear game plan, ladders are notorious for this. If you played other games with ladder systems, especially card games, there are notorious things where these are ladder decks. They wouldn't be good in quote-unquote real play because somebody would just crush you. But because it's a ladder, you can do this super linear game plan that cannot realistically be answered unless your opponent knows it's coming. Now, there's variance involved and other elements in true CCGs that are not present in Phobies. But in those scenarios, in the card games, you can dominate a ladder because, hey, yes, people know this deck exists, but not enough people play it to devote deck slots to. It's not worth it. So now we're going to introduce this whole element that I mentioned earlier into Phobies of the game being decided before you play the game. How bad that will be, I can't tell you because I haven't put a lot of thought into this, but it is a concern that we'd be introducing these sort of problems. Now, continuing from there, it also adds more strategic depth to the game. Instead of being able to respond to any situation with any phobia, you're limited to a smaller pool. That's just not true. There is an element of restrictions breed creativity. However, you could do that again today, present something weird, and if the response is, oh, well, I can't put phobia A on the board because then counterphobia B won't show up, or could show up rather, and then that auto beats my original game plan. And in this new world, people probably won't run B. So what you're saying is you just want the overpowered thing to slam onto the board and crap on your opponent where they can't do anything. Given that we've seen a number of super strong high-level players manage to beat people with quote-unquote bad phobies, should demonstrate to you that it is perfectly feasible to get these phobies onto the board given that you are playing well enough. And again, that's not a knock on this person or anybody else. Say, you're bad, oh my God, get good. That's not where I'm trying to go with this. But the fact of the matter is that you can do a lot of these, if not all these things, right now. You don't have to force the game to change. You don't have to introduce these other things. It's not really necessary. Now, to that end, well, one other point to bring up before we get into that. A lot of people, and this is one of the big issues because you'd alienate people, a lot of people want the aspect that you have access to all the pieces. No one can look at chess or Go or even Hive if you played that game and say those are not skill-based games. The better player wins virtually, if not all the time. Certainly the better player in that game, maybe not the better player overall. They have a bad day, they have an off day, you know what I mean? If you want to play a card game and you want the variance, you want the limited pools, there are options to do that. Now, here's where it feeds into my suggestion, which I did post in my reply to the original thread. You can do this today. And in fact, I'm planning to. What am I planning to do? Well, I've suggested before in my Discord and on stream the idea of Tiny Terrors. Now, the name is kind of new, but the idea of Tiny Terrors is to introduce a pauper format, aka only commons, or probably for Phobies, commons and uncommons, because otherwise I think there were only like 30-something commons. The idea is that you do shrink the available pool, put some constraints on people, and I think there's potential for it to be fun. I think that it should be tested. If you want to play this format, you can literally do it today. Queue up in frenemies. You have the favorites thing on your screen. Just load up all the phobies you want in your favorites. You know, the 10 or 20 or 30 or 60 or however many you decide. However many you and your opponent decide to figure out. Go ahead and put that crew together. Play it out. See how it works. Because I think that at the end of the day, the game was designed how the game was designed for a specific purpose. And what's being asked is to make a new game, essentially. And while I don't think having a new game or a different game is bad, I don't think that Phobies as it is right now should migrate to this other plan. Certainly not in lieu of its existing setup. I think that this could present something really interesting. I think this idea actually has some legs. But there's no reason to force it. And we've talked about this before in the context of other elements, namely 2v2 mode. There are lots of problems with 2v2, but one of them that I'm going to bring up that actually relates to this is splitting queues. Say you have Arena and you have Async. And you have frenemies floating out there also. Now you introduce this mode, whatever the hell we call it. We'll call it CCG mode for now, just to give it a title. You now have CCG mode. So now there are 3 queues. Very quickly, you will balloon the queue times for every single one of those queues, risking potentially the death of Phobies. And I know that sounds extreme, but imagine if you love Phobies, think of a game that you like. A PvP game that you like, that you play every once in a while, you queue up and you're like, all right, I'm having some fun. All right, I'll play a couple games and then you call it a night. Maybe you don't pick it up again for a few weeks. Imagine you logged into that game and you had a 10-minute queue before you could even get into a game. You'd probably drop off that game very quickly. Now that sounds insane when we only have like 10 to 30 second queues most of the time in Phobies. The math behind the scenes for a matchmaker gets very complicated very quickly when you start adding extra elements. You need to very quickly have either growing, as in you're expanding the viable opponents, aka you could be playing people that are outside of your league, not literally like Some of All Fears or Horrors or something, but you just shouldn't be playing against that person skill level or collection wise. Or you just have to have so many people that it doesn't matter. Even big games, say Hearthstone, Marvel Snap, Runeterra, they just don't have that many modes, and they've only carefully added them over the years, the extra ones that have been tacked on. So at the end of the day, you have to be very cautious about these things. I don't think that there's really a need here. I feel like this is somewhat fighting against the intent for Phobies. Now, again, I don't think it's really going to be bad, but I think that it's not going to solve many of these issues that are being presented or as presented. I think it's going to introduce brand new ones and or exacerbate the ones that are being presented as, well, here's a solution to this. And further, you can do it now. As mentioned, I want to introduce for either tournaments or a league, I want to try out Tiny Terrors. I want to try out some of these other formats. I think that there are options for these things to happen, but I don't think that it's worth spending a ton of dev cycles to make this a reality at the moment. But I just wanted to get all those thoughts out there because I did think it was an interesting idea. I do think this is pretty cool. I'll probably pull this for YouTube later. I'm going to check the comments, but I want to put an ender on it. So let me know down in the comments what your thoughts on this. I said it like 100 times, but I do think this is a cool idea. It has some legs, but where would you stand? Would you be interested in this? Would you want to play it for fun and then try it out and then make a decision? Or are you just dead set against it? Let me know. And by the way, while you're down there, likes and subscribes. But as always, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And Black Lives Matter.